Good afternoon. I'm David Luberoff, Deputy Director of the Joint Center, and it's my pleasure to welcome you to our online housing research seminar. Before we begin, I've got three announcements. First, our next event will be on Thursday, March 11th at 4:30 p.m., when we'll host a panel discussion on Cambridge's new 100% affordable housing overlay district, which is a particularly interesting local effort to increase the supply of affordable housing. The panelists will be Aram Farouk, Cambridge's Assistant City Manager for Community Development, Cambridge City Councilor Mark McGovern, and Noah Sawyer, Director of Real Estate for Justice Start, a Cambridge-based CDC. Second, on March 26th at noon, at 12:15, Lily Song, a Joint Center faculty affiliate who's a lecturer in urban planning at GSD, will discuss her work on advancing transit-oriented communities and planning in Los Angeles. That work is supported by the Center's Student Research Support Program, which leads me to my third item. We're now accepting applications for a variety of fellowships and grants that we offer every year to Harvard graduate students and to faculty. Deadlines vary, but range from mid to late March. See our website for more details. Last spring, Gregor Schubert, today's speaker, was one of two people awarded one of our Meyer doctoral dissertation fellowships, which, as the name suggests, support doctoral students writing theses on housing-related topics. The application deadline for that fellowship is March 12th, 2 weeks from today. Before I introduce Gregor, let me note that you can use Zoom's Q&A function to ask questions. We'll try to get to as many of those as we can, but I apologize in advance if we don't get to yours. Also, we will be posting the slide deck, and once we get it captioned, a video of today's talk. That'll probably go up sometime next week. And now to the talk. Gregor is a doctoral student in business economics, a joint program of Harvard's economics department and the Harvard Business School. He'll be telling us about his Meyer-supported work on house price increases and US city migration networks. I've had a preview of this. I think it's really interesting and important research. Gregor will speak for a little more than a half an hour, and then we'll take your questions for about a half an hour. We'll wrap up no later than 1:15 p.m. Gregor, it's all yours.
Thank you for the introduction, David. And thank you everybody for joining in. I'll just take 1 second to share my slides. All right. So I'm very excited to be sharing with you today my research on house price contagion and US city migration networks. And to jump straight in with the motivation, the main motivation for this project is the idea that there's a lot of cross-sectional variation across different housing markets in the US that is sort of in need of an explanation. So for example, the map below shows different commuting zones in the US and the house price growth that they experienced during the main period of the housing boom of the 2000s, from 2000 to 2007. And so as the map shows, in darker colors, you see the areas that have very high house price growth going up to more than 100% over this period. And some areas actually saw negative growth of this period. And so even though this period is known for, on average, very high growth in the US overall, that has attracted a lot of policy and academic attention, we should also be interested in trying to understand why there's this large cross-sectional variation during this time period with a 90th to 10th percentile spread of 91%. At the same time, there are a lot of anecdotes about workers moving between cities and that flow of workers driving house price dynamics in the destination cities that they're moving to. So I just picked one example here. This is a New York Times article from 2 weeks ago that was headlined, "The Californians are coming, so is their housing crisis," in which the author noted that Californians fleeing high home prices are moving to Idaho in droves. Is it possible to import California's growth without also importing its housing problems? And so he's alluding there to something that's been a more general phenomenon where workers have been moving away from expensive coastal metropolises like Los Angeles or San Francisco and moving to smaller cities and driving up home prices in those destinations. So for example, just to show you some data on this, if we look at house prices in Los Angeles and Boise, Idaho, and the migration between the two cities, you get the pattern shown below. focusing first on the dark blue solid line, that's house price growth in Los Angeles. And as you can see, sort of house price growth in Los Angeles increases throughout the 90s and in the early 2000s, and then gets very high with more than 10% annual growth throughout the early 2000s. And then if you look at the migration from Los Angeles to Boise over those time periods, you can see that every time house price growth in Los Angeles goes above 10%, so both in the early 2000s and in more recent years, you see a strong uptick in migrant flows from Los Angeles to Boise. So you see these sort of displacement flows out of Los Angeles into Boise, exactly coinciding with Los Angeles becoming very expensive. And then you see right afterwards, house price growth ticking up in Boise, perhaps in large part driven by these large inflows of migrants. And so these time series all move together and then fall off a cliff during the bust and then recover together. And so this suggests that maybe there's something to the idea that migration flows between cities can explain why particular housing markets are moving together with booming coastal areas while other housing markets are not. Perhaps those are markets that are not as easily reached or not as connected in terms of migration flows to the places that are driving economic cycles in the US. And so in this paper, I asked more generally whether or not migration spillovers between cities in the US can explain spatial differences in house price growth and the degree to which economic shocks originating in particular areas and are propagating more to some cities than to others. I answer this question in two parts. In the first part, which most of the talk today will be about, I focus on the question of whether or not house price changes end up spilling over between cities that share migration links more than between cities that do not share migration links. And in order to answer that question, I look at characteristics of US intercity migration networks. And I should note here that whenever I say city, I'm really talking about commuting zones. I'm talking about sort of like broader areas that include suburbs and sort of the entire region around a city that all is in the same commuting area. I'll use these words interchangeably, but just to sort of clarify the definition. And then I use these migration networks between cities to then estimate a causal effect coming from a shock in one city and the degree to which a shock in one city ends up affecting other cities that are linked to that city through a migration channel. And then I take that causal effect and I look at the effect those spillovers have on house prices, population, mortgage lending, and construction in the destination city that's on the receiving end of these migration flows. And then I look at whether or not this migration mechanism, these spillover effects, can help us understand historical episodes in terms of explaining which areas are seeing larger house price growth than others in historical time periods. There's a second part to the paper that I'm not going to cover today, and for which you should see the paper. If you just Google my name, you can probably find my academic website, and at some point we'll also post it through the Housing Center, where I focus on more aggregate patterns. And so stepping away from sort of these links between particular cities, we might also be interested in the overall pattern of house price growth in the US and the degree to which it is more or less likely that we see very extreme house price events if workers are more or less mobile. And then also there's a related question of, as mobility of workers changes over time, how would that affect this transmission mechanism between cities? And so in that part of the paper, I construct a dynamic spatial equilibrium model that captures all the key elements of the transmission mechanism between cities. And then I estimate the key parameters that characterize this transmission mechanism, and then use that to simulate the impact that wage shocks have on the distribution of house price growth under different scenarios. And those scenarios are motivated by recent changes in fundamentals, on the one hand related to mobility. There's been a secular decline in migration between cities over the last 3 decades, and also by scenarios related to supply constraints. There's been an increase in the constraints on housing markets over the last 2 decades in most US cities. And so there's been a lot of policy interest in what would happen if we were able to bring back down those supply constraints and what that would do to the overall house price dynamics in the US. So again, if you're interested in the second part, have a look at the paper. And I'm also, I'd also be happy to answer questions about this today, but for time reason, I won't get to talk about this in detail. What do I find? let me just give you a quick preview of the findings and then walk you through the details of how to get to them. So I find that there are large house price spillover effects between US cities. So for example, my estimates suggest that a 10% increase in house prices in other cities is on average associated with a 6% increase in house prices in your city and a 2% increase in population in the long run. So there's substantial spillover from shocks in other cities to your city. There are also strong effects on local mortgage credit and construction as a result of house prices going up in other cities. And so that supports this idea that these spillovers are driven really by a mechanism where you get additional inflows of population that then drives up local housing demand. And that explains why you end up seeing connections between particular housing markets. And in terms of the ability of this mechanism to explain cross-sectional patterns, I show that, for example, if you look at the impact that interest rate declines had on particular cities, and then you study the indirect effects through migration links on other cities that you'd expect from that, those indirect effects by themselves are able to explain 32% of the cross-sectional house price variation in the run-up to the housing boom of the 2000s. Another thing that sort of supports this idea that migration links are important for housing markets is a finding that migration links between particular markets are really good predictors of co-movement in housing markets. So if you were interested in just knowing whether two cities are going to have house prices that move up and down together, and you had a set of various connections between those cities to choose from, it turns out migration links are really good predictors of disconnection in housing markets. And in the paper, I show that they're actually better predictors than a plausible set of other measures of links between cities that one might come up with. In the part that I'm not going to talk about today, I do end up showing that more mobility in general in the US ends up resulting in less dispersed house price growth. And the intuition for that is that mobility in the US basically operates as an escape valve. So you have very concentrated economic shocks that affect particular cities, and those concentrated economic shocks are able to disperse over a larger number of locations as a result of workers moving out of the initially shocked cities. And so you end up getting more moderate effects in a larger number of locations, and that ends up compressing the overall distribution and the differences between cities and house price growth. And another thing I show there is that you can get a somewhat similar effect in terms of compressing the distribution of house price growth by lowering supply constraints in the most constrained cities. However, that kind of policy that addresses supply constraints actually interacts with mobility in an interesting way. It turns out that policies addressing supply constraints are more impactful if workers are less able to move. And the intuition for that is that mobility and supply constraints are really a substitute in terms of cities' ability to deal with shocks. So if you're, in normal times, if workers are able to move and there's a strong economic shock on your city that would drive up house prices a lot because your city is very constrained, then workers' ability to move out to other cities ends up taking some of that shock with them and ends up mitigating the impact on your city. If workers, on the other hand, are stuck in place, they can't move out, that means that your city is bearing the full brunt of the initial shock as a result of having very constrained housing markets. And so that makes any policy that addresses those supply constraints more impactful than if workers were able to move. Okay. In order to fix ideas, I've been talking about these migration spillovers. Let me talk you through what I mean when I say that there might be a migration spillover transmission mechanism between cities. I'll be talking through this in words. If you want to see sort of the equations behind this, have a look at the quantitative model in the paper. But today I just want to convey to you the intuition of what I think is going on and what motivates the empirical analysis in this project. So the idea is that when an area receives a positive economic shock, that drives up the productivity of a particular group of workers, those workers will see an increase in their wages, and as a result, there'll be an increase of additional workers of that group into the area. To make that concrete, for example, over the last 20 years or so, as a result of changes in communication technology, there has been an increase in the productivity of skilled service sector and technology sector workers in cities like Boston. As a result, Boston has seen an increase in wages for those workers and strong inflows of high-skilled, highly educated workers into the area. That inflow of workers drives up house prices as a result of supply constraints on providing additional housing. And those increases in living costs then end up driving out other groups of workers that are less benefiting from the economic boom. So to stick with the Boston example, less educated workers might end up moving out because they don't see their wages go up, but they see their housing costs increase. And those outflows of workers are more likely to go to other cities that have pre-existing migration links with the cities that they're coming from. And for those destination cities, that means there's an increase in local population, an increase in local housing demand as a result of that. And so then as a result of either congestion in the construction sector or permanent constraints on additional construction, those destinations will see an increase in their house prices as a result of these flows. And so what we'll see empirically in the data is that house price increases in particular origin cities end up being linked to other house price increases in other cities that share migration links with the city where a boom originates. To make this abstract mechanism a little more concrete, let me talk you through a suggestive case study of where I think we're seeing some of these effects. So in particular, I want to focus on a set of cities called so-called superstar cities. So in the urban economics literature, there was a paper in 2013 that defined a number of large cities as so-called superstars based on their characteristics before the year 2000. And so in that paper, the authors show that between 1970 and 2000, there were a couple of large mostly coastal cities that experienced very high demand for housing, but had very supply constrained housing markets. So as a result, they saw, even for modest increase in population, they saw rapid increases in house prices. And so these are prime candidates for the spillover mechanism because those would be the cities that we expect during a boom to become expensive very quickly, and as a result, trigger this outflow of workers who then look for more affordable housing elsewhere. And so I look at where those workers who are leaving expensive superstar cities are likely to go. And in order to identify those cities, I just look at the top 4 destinations for each superstar city between 1990 and 2000 and call those destination cities spillover cities. So I put all those in a bucket, and then I want to look at what happens after the year 2000 to these 2 groups of cities, the superstar cities that are likely to become expensive during a boom, and the spillover cities that are likely to receive migrant flows that result from that. And so that's what's shown in the graph below. So this graph shows on the bottom axis population growth over the main period of the housing boom of the 2000s. And on the vertical axis, house price growth over the same period. So you can think of this as sort of price and quantity. And then the depicted cities are all the large cities in the US focusing first on the cities in orange. These are these superstar cities that were identified ex ante, and they continue behaving in the same way with the same characteristics based on which they were identified, which is that they see modest population growth, but very high house price growth. So they have very constrained housing markets. As a result, house prices go up a lot, even for modest increases in population. And then in blue, you see these spillover cities that I identified based on their tendency to receive a lot of migrants from the superstar cities. And so as you can see, almost all of these spillover cities, with the small exception of Buffalo, New York, are towards the upper right corner of the graph. So they have very high population growth and or very high house price growth over this period of the housing boom. And this perspective of looking at sort of likely destinations for migrants and population growth as a driver of house price growth helps us resolve some of the puzzles that have arisen in the literature around why particular areas were seeing particularly volatile boom periods in the early 2000s. So for example, in a well-cited review paper, Todd Sinai at Wharton noted in 2012 that Phoenix, Las Vegas, the Inland Empire of California, and much of Southern Florida clearly experienced an unusual event in the boom of the 2000s. Here noting that sort of conventional theories of local shocks that are driving housing markets don't seem to be able to explain what was going on in those cities. But if we look at the graph above, it is exactly those cities that he mentioned, so Phoenix, Las Vegas, inland California and southern Florida, those are exactly these spillover cities. So the cities that are likely to receive a lot of migrant flows. And we see over this time period that they do in fact receive very large population growth as a result of in-migration during the housing boom. And so this tendency of some of these cities to receive a lot of in-migration might give us a handle on why they see particularly bubbly and volatile housing markets over this time period. More generally, in the empirical analysis in the paper, I construct migration links that form a migration network between all the cities in the US. And so I define a migration link from one city to another as consisting of a non-zero migration flow from or to some other city that can be identified in IRS data. And just to give you an example of what this data looks like, so for example, for the city of Boston, this map shows the share of inflows into Boston coming from different other commuting zones in the US during the housing boom of the 2000s. And so areas that are marked in darker color here indicate areas that contribute a larger share of the migration into Boston. So as you can see, sort of most of the migrants into Boston, of course, come from surrounding areas in New England. But many migrants are also coming from Florida, coastal California, the Pacific Northwest, as well as Chicago and various other highly educated metropolitan areas around the US. And there are also many areas in the country that are colored white here that are basically have flows that are indistinguishable from zero into Boston. So there's almost no migration coming from those areas. And so as this map shows, you can sort of characterize the inflow network of people coming into Boston by looking at a relatively small share of the total number of commuting zones in the US. And that's generally true of migration networks in the US. So I show in the paper that overall migration networks are pretty sparse. So the average city only has around 30 substantive links with other cities in a given year. And these links are highly persistent over time. So they're not randomly generated. It turns out that the same link in one year ends up still being there on average with an 80% probability 10 years later. And part of the reason for that is that, as I show in the paper, that greater migration flows between cities can be in part explained by similarities in relatively time-invariant characteristics. So for example, cities that have a similar ethnic composition, a similar industry structure, similar natural amenities, and similar culture, or that are located in a similar region and somewhat closer to one another, end up having greater migration flows. And so to the degree that those similarities do not change rapidly over time, that explains why we see these strong links between particular pairs of cities that then persist over time. And so in the empirical analysis, I take these migration links, and I take them as given in a baseline period in the early 90s, and then use them to try to predict the exposure that a city has to shocks in housing markets in other cities as a result of these migration links. And I'll make concrete what I mean by exposure by just looking at a small example of a network of cities. So going back to our Boise, LA example, if we're thinking about exposure that Boise has to shocks in other housing markets, then of course, we should think about first about direct connections that Boise has to other markets through migration flows. So for example, because Los Angeles sends a lot of migrants into Boise, any shock to Los Angeles housing market, so if Los Angeles becomes more expensive, might trigger a relatively large flow into Boise that has a big impact on Boise housing market. So Boise has a lot of exposure to Los Angeles as a result of a strong direct link in migration flows between these two cities. But because we're talking about a network of cities, it's not just direct links that matter, but indirect links can also matter because a city might compete with a third city for migrants from another city, even if they don't have any direct connection between them. So to make that concrete, if there are a lot of people that move from Los Angeles to San Diego in a given year, that means that that anything that happens to housing markets in San Diego will redirect a lot of migrants from Los Angeles. So for example, if San Diego becomes very expensive, that might redirect a lot of migrants from Los Angeles to Boise. And so as a result, Boise is really also indirectly exposed to shocks in the San Diego housing market to the degree that there's both a direct link to Los Angeles and then an indirect link from Los Angeles to San Diego. And so I end up defining an exposure measure from one city to another city that sums over all these direct and indirect links, so all the different paths in some sense that you have between one city and another, and use those links to define a migration exposure measure from each city to each other city in the US. And so that ends up being a measure that ranges from 0 to 1, where 0 indicates that those two cities have absolutely no direct or indirect connection with one another, and 1 would indicate that the other city is the sole source of migrants into the city that we're interested in. And then I use these migration exposure measures for each city to define how exposed that city is to house price growth in other cities. So I define this measure of network exposure to house price growth, delta P and W, that is constructed as the weighted average of house price growth in all the other cities in the US, with the weights consisting of the migration exposure to those other cities. So if the cities that you are linked to and that you're competing for migrants with are experiencing very high house price growth, you will get a larger network exposure to house price growth than if all the cities that you're connected to have stagnant housing markets. And so then what we're interested in is estimating a spillover effect that represents the effect that those house price changes in your network have on house prices in your city as a result of sharing these migration links. And so I estimate this regression equation where I estimate the effect on the cumulative change in house prices in some city I over time that results from changes in house prices in the other cities that city I is connected to. And we're interested here in this spillover effect, the degree to which those house price changes in the other cities end up passing through into house price changes in my city. Of course, there's some concern here that it might be difficult to estimate a causal effect here because these variables might be moving together as a result of sort of aggregate common shocks. And so I include a large number of control variables that control for sort of regional trends and various other local characteristics that might be driving local house price changes other than these spillover effects. In order to estimate a causal spillover effect here, perhaps the ideal experiment that we'd like to run would be one where we exogenously are able to assign house price changes to particular cities. And then we can look at whether or not the cities that are more linked to those treated units end up seeing higher house price growth on average than the cities that are not linked to these treated units. Of course, I can't run such an experiment, but I try to come as close as possible to it by basically constructing shocks that induce exogenous variation in this network house price change that a city is exposed to, and then looking at how those exogenous changes in a city's network house prices end up spilling over to the city itself. So just to visualize this approach again, so I construct shocks that, for example, drive up house prices in San Diego, and then I look at what that does to what those shocks do to house prices in Boise as a result of this indirect migration connection between Boise and San Diego. And one important thing that I control for in the estimation is that, of course, any shock to San Diego, however I constructed it, so I end up constructing these as wage shocks as a result of the industry structure in San Diego. I want to make sure that any shock that I construct might not also have a direct effect on Boise itself. So I'll strip out and orthogonalize my estimates with regard to any direct impacts on Boise to make sure that my estimates are really coming through this indirect channel. So these shocks are constructed as wage shocks coming from a city's industry structure in 1990, interacting with national trends in wages that sort of end up generating plausibly exogenous variation in local wages as a result of industry structure rather than some local time varying shocks. And I interact those with local supply constraints that drive differences in the degree to which house prices are affected by these wage shocks. And then these shocks to other cities are then used to identify exogenous variation in the network house price changes that my city is exposed to, and that allow me to identify the spillover effect that we're interested in. Okay. So what do I find? So I estimate this equation on a large panel of commuting zones that cover almost the entire US from 1991 to 2017. And I'm going to show you my estimates of this spillover effect on various local characteristics in the destination cities. And so first, let's look at house prices. So this graph shows the effect on local house prices of of a 1% change on average in house prices in the other cities that my city is connected to. And so these are the effects in the initial year of the shock and then in the years afterwards. So as you can see, there's sort of an initial impact that then increases over the first 2 years afterwards. So as you'd expect in a migration setting, it takes a while for migrants to react to an initial price change. And so the shock sort of takes effect over multiple years. And so the full shock is sort of realized after around 2 years from the initial shock in house prices to other cities, and then stabilizes around a long run level with a long run pass-through here of around 63%. So what that means is that I find that on average, when house prices go up by, for example, 10% in the other cities that your city is connected to, that ends up driving up house prices in your city by around 6% in the long run. Of course, I'm arguing that this is an effect that operates through migration flows and is as a result of people being driven out of those other cities that I'm connected to. And so I should see a very similar effect for population changes. And so that's what I look at next. So I do the exact same estimation, but I look at the spillover effects on local population in the destination cities. And I find a very similar time pattern with an effect on population that increases over the first 2 years after the initial shock and then stabilizes over time. And so the long run effect here corresponds to around a 2% increase in population in the destination city as a result of a 10% increase in house prices in the other cities that the city is connected to. In the paper, I do a number of robustness checks, changing the definition of migration networks, controlling for a bunch of other things, and find that these effects are quite robust. One important thing that I do in the paper as well is I look at other local variables other than house price and population and how they react to these spillovers. So most importantly, I look at mortgage lending and construction, and I find that local mortgage lending and construction pick up rapidly when house prices go up in other cities that you're connected to. So that suggests that really the shock is coming from a spillover in terms of people coming in who then demand mortgages and trigger a building boom in the cities that they're moving to, which supports this migration mechanism. I provide a bunch of additional descriptive evidence in the paper around the different parts of the mechanism that I won't have time to get into today, but feel free to ask a question later on about that or have a look at the paper. One important question that remains is how important this whole migration mechanism is. Of course, this is a general mechanism in the sense that any kind of shock to another city might end up spilling over to my city through a migration channel. And so what I do is I look at shocks that other people in other research have shown to affect housing markets, and I look at what my model predicts to be the indirect effects of those shocks. So in particular, in one case, I look at the effect that interest rate declines in the run-up to the housing boom of the 2000s, interacting with local supply constraints, have been predicted to have on housing markets. So that's something that other people have shown. And then I use my model of migration links and my estimates of spillover effects to predict what the indirect effects of these of the house price changes induced by these interest rate declines should be. And then I want to see whether or not these predicted indirect effects have some additional explanatory power in terms of understanding cross-sectional patterns of what cities saw higher house price growth than others. And so that's what's shown in this graph below. So on the bottom axis is this predicted indirect spillover effect from interest rate induced changes in house prices. And then on the vertical axis is actual house price growth from 1995 to 2007. As you can see, there's sort of a strong positive slope with an R squared of 32%. So these indirect spillover effects help us to better understand the degree to which some cities see higher house price growth than others in the run-up to the housing boom of the 2000s. In the paper, I repeat this exercise with a different set of shocks and for a different time period, and again, sort of find substantial ability of this indirect spillover mechanism to explain additional variation in house price growth. What's the point of all of this for policymakers and other stakeholders? So I think one important takeaway from this research is that to the degree that spillover effects allow us to see house price effects in locations other than the places where a shock originates, it should change our estimate of what house price dynamics that we're seeing are speculative versus driven by fundamentals. So if I can have a shock in Boston that ends up driving housing market demand in Portland, Maine, for example, that should alter our estimation of how much of those housing market dynamics in Portland are understandable through fundamentals versus explained by speculative bubble dynamics. And that then should change the degree to which we want to address that through macroeconomic policy or financial regulation. For local policymakers and developers, one important takeaway is that these migration links between cities and the co-movement in housing markets between linked cities helps you anticipate local housing demand. So if you know that housing markets that share migration connections always tend to move together, that enables local housing officials as well as local developers to reduce the lags in construction in terms of reacting to changes in the market and thereby stabilize prices. And as a result of stable prices, you then end up seeing less political conflict over displacement. So for example, if housing markets in Boston are picking up and Boston is becoming very expensive, policymakers and developers in, let's stick with the example, Portland, Maine, should anticipate that this will trigger an inflow of people into their local housing markets, and therefore should try to anticipate that through zoning and permitting and starting additional construction in order to sort of get ahead of the coming wave of migrants. And of course, these connections between different areas that might be relatively far apart at times represent an externality from policymaking in particular areas. So constraints on housing supply and a lack of new construction in areas like Boston or San Francisco or Los Angeles is not just a local problem for those cities, but it's actually a problem that ends up spilling over into other cities' housing markets. And so in order to achieve particular goals with regard to housing affordability and overall patterns of house price growth, this analysis raises the need for intercity coordination between policymakers. And then a last stakeholder that might be interested in this are real estate investors. To the degree that we're striving for diversification in real estate portfolios, and we don't want a lot of investments that co-move together, thinking about migration links as predicting co-movement in housing markets can help real estate investors better diversify their portfolio by avoiding markets that have these strong links and as a result will move up and down together. And so to conclude, before we get into questions, so in this analysis, I show that there are spillovers from house price changes in migration-linked cities with around a long-run pass-through from in prices from one city to another of around 63%. And local population, mortgage credit, and construction all increase as a result of these house price changes in other cities, in line with a mechanism that's really operating through migration flows that drive up housing demand. And these migration links are able to explain a substantial share of the cross-section of house price dynamics that we see in historical patterns. So for example, I mentioned the analysis related to the spillovers from how interest rate declines are driving house prices, where the indirect effects were able to explain around 32% of the variation in the run-up to the boom. And in an analysis I didn't show you, I also show that migration links between particular cities are really good predictors of co-movement in particular pairs of housing markets. I am currently working on additional work that sort of builds on this analysis related to, on the one hand, the effect of these migration flows on other financial markets. So you might think that migration flows between cities do not just affect housing markets in the destinations, but also, for example, local banking markets as a result of this large increase in demand for mortgages. Another project I'm working on is looking at whether or not migration risk and the degree to which different housing markets co-move as a result of migration links is already priced in real estate assets. And another topic that's become quite relevant over the last year is the degree to which this way of thinking about housing markets as being connected through migration flows allows us to better understand the house price dynamics and evolution of cities that we're seeing right now as a result of an increase in remote work and COVID-19, and how cities will evolve in the future as a result of people's shifts in preferences of where to live, and how that affects some cities more than others because they're connected to the cities that are driving outflows of people. Okay, thank you so much for listening to the presentation. I think we can now open it up to questions.
Gregor, thank you. There's just a really, I think, interesting and thought-provoking. Let me start. There was a question. You're talking about house prices, and there's been some questions about whether you distinguish between house prices and rents. And in particular, we might worry about a shock. I don't know whether you can say whether these are rents and house prices both behave similarly, but if we're thinking particularly about low-income renters who might be most vulnerable to these shocks.
Yeah, so that's a great question. There's mostly a data issue around rents, which is, so in this paper, I mostly focused on house prices because it's very hard to get long panels of rental prices for that cover the entire US. And so as a result, I sort of am constrained in my data in terms of looking at house prices. We would expect there to be similar dynamics in terms of rental markets, and in the quantitative estimation in the paper that I didn't show you today, I do try to sort of model the degree to which there's a pass-through from house price changes into rental prices. But yeah, for data reasons, it's much harder to study the rental part. We would expect there to be relatively similar dynamics in rental markets, and sort of suggestive evidence that I've seen, for instance, from more recent data that's become available through Zillow and other data sources, seems to suggest that the movements in rental markets might be quite similar, but they might be amplified or mitigated to some degree to the extent that housing markets experience additional shocks on the price side as a result of valuation changes.
And I guess related to that, have you done any assessment as to what happens to affordability? So, for example, the percentage of people who report being cost burdened, does that tend to increase at the same rate, or does the movement of people also bring with it an increase in wages, and so affordability measures might not change that much?
So the analyses that I do in the paper all end up controlling for wage changes. So I would think of them as sort of like being net increases in housing cost after allowing for changes in wages. And so, because that's exactly the mechanism I'm interested in, which is the one where sort of living costs go up for one group of people more than their wage increase. And so as a result, they end up moving out of particular cities. And so there I'm really interested in the affordability effect that ends up driving the migration. And for the destination city, to the degree that these inflows of migrants drive up house prices without driving any additional change in local wages, we would expect them to drive local affordability as well and reduce affordability in the destination city.
Interesting. There are a couple of questions wondering if you've ever applied sort of the same framework to climate change and natural disasters. So there are these shocks. For example, one of the questioners noted after the hurricanes in 2017, the huge outflow of people from Puerto Rico, as your data would suggest, going to some very specific metropolitan areas. Is that something that you've looked at or would care to speculate on?
I've not looked at that in particular. However, there's some good research that looks at those particular cases. So, so for example, with regard to the impact of climate change on sort of a system of cities and economies as a whole, there's a great recent paper by Esteban Rossi Hansberg, if someone wants to look that up, and who look at sort of the overall system of countries and regions, and what happens as a result of some areas being shocked and people moving out and moving to other places, and sort of trying to think about all of that together. The other thing I can note is Greg Howard at the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign has a paper that looks at sort of the local impact of migration on local labor markets. And he notes that when he looks at Hurricane Katrina in particular, and migration out of New Orleans that resulted from that, he finds that sort of there are significant impacts on the destination cities for people who are fleeing from the hurricane there, and that impact the cities that they're going to.
There's a interesting question about the nature of the migration flows. I think you mentioned that college-educated workers, non-college educated workers moved out of superstar cities, even as college-educated workers were moving into those cities. And I'm wondering, if you have any assessment of kind of the relative magnitude of the flows.
Yes, I don't know if I can share my screen again. I can actually show you an analysis related to that.
Your talk, your screen.
I've closed out the presentation. Give me 1 second. Yeah, so I've definitely, so I actually have a lot of sort of descriptive analyses that try to exactly get at this question in the paper. Can you, is this now shared? No, this is not shared.
Nope, not yet.
Okay, I think you should now be able to see my slides again.
Yep.
Okay. Yeah. So let me show you those. Yeah. So I have exactly some analyses around this question of how large this displacement is and to what degree we see these differences between educated, non-college educated workers. And I can show you a bunch of analyses around this. So on the one hand, we see as sort of educated, non-college educated workers moving to opposite directions in the US in terms of the gradient of house prices between the cities that they're moving between. So this graph below shows the average change in house prices. So between the city that you're coming from and the city that you're going to for college and non-college educated workers. So if the average house in the city that you're going to is $1,000 more expensive than the average house in the city that you're coming from, that would be like plus 1,000 here in this analysis. And so I showed this on average for different education groups. And so what this graph shows is that over time, it has been the case, at least since 2005, which is as far back as the data goes, that college educated workers have on average been moving to more expensive cities than the city that they were coming from. And non-college educated workers have been moving sort of in the opposite direction, moving into cities that were on average $20,000 cheaper for the average house, for instance, at the height of the boom, than the city that they were coming from. So you clearly see this sort of mechanism where on a gradient of house prices, college educated workers are moving up to more expensive cities and non-college educated workers are moving down. And what you can also see is that this mechanism of displacement sort of ends up varying over time. So this pushing out of non-college educated workers where they're moving to cheaper cities is strongest in the boom, and then it falls off during the housing bust and then sort of starts recovering after a while. And so that really suggests that this move of non-college educated workers out of expensive cities is associated with those cities booming to some degree. And then the other analysis related to this is one where I look at the city level, whether or not greater inflows of college educated workers are associated with greater outflows of non-college educated workers. And so the first thing to note is, so this graph shows on the bottom the inflow rate of college educated workers, so the percent of the percentage inflow of the percent change in your college educated population as a result of inflows, and on the vertical axis, the percent change in your non-college educated population as a result of outflows. And as you can see, they're highly positively correlated. So if your city sees higher inflows of college educated workers, it also usually sees higher outflows of non-college educated workers. And an additional little twist here is that this varies between cities that have different supply constraints in the housing market. So the line in red shows the slope between these two variables for cities that are very constrained, and the line in blue shows it for cities that are not very constrained. And so the cities in red are the cities where you'd expect housing markets to be more zero-sum. They're very constrained in terms of building additional housing. So you'd expect those to be the places where an inflow of college educated workers pushes out more non-college educated workers because they're worse at accommodating additional flows of people. And so that's exactly what we see in the data, is that you see a steeper slope, a greater pushing out of non-college educated populations in the areas that are more supply constraints, where you have more of these zero-sum housing markets.
I'm still digesting this, but this is fascinating, and I think it's huge implications. There's a very basic question just on how you're measuring house prices. Are you using sales price, assessed value, something else?
Yeah, so I use two different measures. So on the one hand, for the longer panels, I use the repeat sales house price indices provided by the Federal Housing Finance Authority, so it's a repeat sales index. So hopefully that controls to some degree for quality differences in housing. So you take one house and you sort of observe it over time as it gets sold, and then use those repeated sales data points in order to construct an index of house price changes for each area. And then another measure of house price that I use for levels of house prices, so when I'm not interested in growth rates, is one that is quality, where I quality adjust observed levels of house prices. So for the analysis that I just showed you, for the gradient of house prices where college and non-college educated workers are moving to, I take house prices that are observed in the American Community Survey. I run a hedonic regression, so I adjust them for sort of the valuation of different characteristics of the housing, and use that to then sort of compare standardized housing units between different cities in order to be able to compare sort of apples to apples between different areas.
We've had a bunch of questions wondering about whether you've got any preliminary thoughts or findings about the pandemic, particularly given that whether or not some of these the superstar cities are going to continue to be superstar cities. So wondering what you can tell us so far.
Yeah. So one big caveat is that I don't sort of have like full administrative data and good data sets yet on this period, just because, you know, there's a lag in administrative data of 1 or 2 years. And so we'll probably really get the like really good analyses and the really good data on this period 2 years from now. What I can say so far, though, is that the way you'd think about this in my framework is that in some sense, the pandemic imposes an additional cost on living in very dense cities. So you can think of this as sort of a non-monetary price of housing going up in those places, because you now, on top of sort of paying for your rent, you're also paying a non-monetary cost of an additional pandemic risk. And so in some sense, you can use the exact same framework to think about this as now just being a cost shock to some areas that consists of a health cost shock on top of a monetary cost change. And so what you'd expect then to happen is that the densest areas that are getting this largest non-monetary cost shock should see very, very similar dynamics to what we see from a monetary cost shock, which is that people end up moving out, and they end up moving out to cities that have pre-existing migration links to the city that they're coming from. And so we'd expect the cities to have, and so we would expect housing markets to be doing relatively well in exactly those cities that have strong pre-existing migration links to the dense cities that are losing population as a result of this health risk that has shocked the housing markets. And that's exactly what you seem to be seeing if I look at sort of anecdotally at recent data on which housing markets are holding up relatively well. So one example you see, for instance, is that I mentioned the New York Times article at the outset. Places like Boise, Idaho, that are traditional destinations for workers moving out of coastal California, are booming right now and are seeing really high house price growth that seems to be driven by these inflows of people moving out of dense cities as a result of the pandemic. And so the sort of dynamics I'm describing in this paper seem to be persisting in the recent time period. The other thing that you're seeing, for example, is that places like Las Vegas or Phoenix that have really badly hit local employment and industry. So Las Vegas is to a large degree driven by hospitality that has seen a complete shutdown in many parts. Nonetheless, places like Las Vegas and Phoenix have actually seen positive and relatively high house price growth. And so the housing markets there are sort of decoupled from local employment, partially as a result of those places being really popular destinations for people moving out of denser parts of coastal California. And so that disconnect between housing markets in those areas and their local employment declining can be explained through this model by these migration flows and these migration linkages.
If I understand you right, there's an important twist though, because a lot of the earlier migration essentially were folks who were being priced out of a market because they weren't essentially benefiting from the wage shock. But in a sense, there's a whole group of workers who both benefited from the wage shock, but now absolutely don't have to be in San Francisco or Los Angeles or Boston. They can be anywhere, so that they can look at these migration networks.
Exactly. In some sense, it sort of like supercharges some of these dynamics because you, beforehand, it might have been the case that even though you were not benefiting from the boom as much in San Francisco, that was still where your job was located, and would have been costly for you to sort of move around and look for a new job. But now you actually can move while retaining that job. And so you're now more easily able to avoid the expensive housing markets without incurring the cost of having to switch jobs necessarily. And so in some sense, that sort of accelerates that move away from very expensive areas for some worker groups.
And that seems like it leads actually to another question that's come up about whether there's been a shift in destination cities. And I guess I would broaden that out to think about, are there particular characteristics of destination cities beyond low housing prices? So I guess I'm thinking that either certain climate factors or certain kind of amenity factors that help you explain both the networks and any changes you're seeing.
Yeah, let me, I can actually give you some data on that. So I mentioned this briefly at the beginning. So the paper has a bunch of analysis around migration costs and sort of what's driving particular links between cities and why people are moving to particular places. And so one thing that I look at is that I analyze what characteristics between cities are driving greater links between them. So why are you moving from Los Angeles to Las Vegas rather than to Topeka, Kansas? And so that's what's shown in this table. So I looked at a bunch of different characteristics, and I basically find that if places are further apart in terms of these characteristics, you're less likely to see movement between them. So that's why there are negative coefficients here. And so what I find is that being in a different region, of course, lowers the connection between cities and lowers the amount of flows, but also having different culture, which is here proxied by the share of non-traditional Christian denominations, really lowers the amount of migration that you see between areas, and having different ethnic compositions of the area, as well as different industry composition, makes people less likely to move between particular places. Of course, these are sort of observables. There may be additional sort of historical path dependence that creates stronger links between particular cities that then persist over time as a result of sort of social network connections that are stable and that are operating in addition to these observable similarities between places. So for example, sticking with the Boise example, even if you go back to 1980 and you look at the census of where people were born who were living in Idaho, it turns out that the largest source of people who have moved into Idaho, even back in 1980, was California. And so there's been sort of there's a strong historical connection between those places that probably drives a lot of family and friendship links that would make it easier for you to move from Los Angeles to Boise rather than to another place that doesn't have those historical links.
Well, we've got a bunch of other great questions, but I did promise that we would end at 1:15, and we've hit that time. So apologies to those of you who posed questions that we didn't get to. We will share these with Gregor, and he may decide to follow up with some of you. As I said at the beginning, this is our fellowship season, and the Meyer Dissertation Fellowship, which is one of the two oldest of our fellowships, along with the Gramlich Fellowship, is one that's really near and dear to our hearts, and it really aims to try and encourage and support young scholars like Gregor as they get going, with the hopes that they will make significant contributions to research. This, I think, is fascinating work. As Gregor mentioned, the paper is available on his website, and we will be publishing a version of it in our working paper series, and Gregor will be writing a blog about that. So stay tuned for that. Gregor, I want to thank you for just a really fascinating and thought-provoking presentation. And unfortunately, you can't hear everybody clap, but were they able to, I'm sure you would be getting a very warm reception. And thank you all for joining us, and look forward to seeing some of you again on March 11th, when we discuss Cambridge's Affordable Housing Overlay District. Have a great afternoon, everybody.
Thank you.